Arlie, thanks very much for being with the Iqbal Ahmed Center for Public Education. You're a board member of that now. I want to use your wonderful book, Strangers in Their Own Land, to understand American society and politics today. You see, because we here in Pakistan have always thought of America as one country. The Democrats and Republicans, yeah, but they're like Tweedledum and Tweedledee. There's not much of a difference because they're all pro-capitalists and they've all supported imperial wars. But now we see that America is actually two different countries and they're at war with each other. So how did America get there? Can you explain?
Yes, I can well understand how the Democrats and Republicans in the United States looked like Tweedledum and Tweedledee. In a policy sense, that there's a certain truth to that. But I think that in the last 30 years, with globalization, there have been winners and losers. And within each country, one sees that. And in the United States, the Democratic Party has come to represent, without meaning to, kind of the winners of this. That is, the highly educated, the coastal elites, so to speak, as well as and on the other hand, the losers of globalization, that would be the white working class in the middle areas and the Rust Belt areas in the south of the United States. These two groups each have leaders, and I would say that the right wing in the United States has taken over Tweedledum, the Republican Party, and it is the elite of the losers who are leading the pack. And I've been spending the last 5 years studying them.
So doesn't this flip Marxist theory on its head? After all, according to Marx, it's the working class that's progressive, that's going to ask for justice. And indeed, that's the way it was back in the 1930s and 40s in the United States. But now the American working class seems to be for the most regressive things. It's against all ideas of justice. They're willing to accept discrimination and lack of labor rights and they just don't seem to be progressive anymore. What's happened?
Yes, that's right. It's completely turned Marx on his head in this way. It's true. In the 1930s, certainly, and if you look at FDR, this was a period of American history where the Democratic Party embraced the working class of all races. But that's not true today. It's a new story today. Yeah, the right wing now has, and Donald Trump as its champion, has really captured the largest group of the American working class, and that's white working class voters, and speaks only to them and revs them up. And we are now in the grips of this, a new movement, a populist right-wing movement within the United States.
So it seems as if Trump supporters are willing to forgive him everything, his lies, his transgressions, his fake tweets, everything, including, of course, that Stormy Daniels episode, which, by the way, seems to violate everything that the church-going people stand for. After all, his liaison with a prostitute and then his cover-up, his lies, and that's just one example. So how is it that people are willing to put their values to one side in their blind support for Donald Trump?
Well, okay, we have to back up. We have to back up and understand that for them, he's the only voice they hear that seems to be, even in the slightest, representing them. The most important thing is to understand a void, that where the Democratic Party used to be, where a vibrant labor movement used to be, there is a void in areas where, for whites with high school educations, your income has sunk in the last 30 years by half. And your families are falling apart. You're not going to church as much if you are a high school educated white in a Rust Belt area or in the South. So I should tell a little about the background of this book. In 2011, I realized that our country was splitting in half and that we were all in bubbles, geographic bubbles and media bubbles. We weren't reading the same newspapers. Electronic bubbles. Our computers gave us back to ourselves, wherever we were.
Fox versus CNN.
What?
Fox versus CNN.
Yes, precisely. And so I have long taught sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, and Berkeley, California, which is a very democratic, very progressive state, city, university. And I realized that I had to get out of my bubble and go to a bubble as far right as Berkeley, California is to the left. Take my alarm system off and really try to climb into the shoes of people I knew I would have every kind of difference with. And I spent 5 years doing that. I went to the South because that's where the right has grown the fastest and the strongest. And where in the South? Well, the Super South, Louisiana. And where in Louisiana? To the oil refineries in the Southwest. And who did I talk to? Older, white oil workers and petrochemical workers. And then really all around the state. Over 5 years, I got to talk to people. And there's a paradox that I had in mind there that underlies this whole question of Tweedledum and Tweedledee. How could it be that in the United States, it's the poorest states, the states with the most disrupted family, the worst education, the worst medical care, the most pollution, the lowest life expectancies, are the very same states that take more money from the federal government in aid than they give to it in tax dollars and hate the federal government, like the Tea Party. That's the red state paradox. Wait a minute, how could this be? And Louisiana turned out to be an exaggerated version of this. Second poorest state in all of the U.S., 44% of its state budget came from the federal government. And yet it was overwhelmingly highly conservative, distrusted the federal government, didn't want regulations, didn't want welfare. So I thought, that's the paradox. I don't understand. In my bubble, this makes no sense.
It must have been very uncomfortable for you to be with people with whom you have such a terrible disconnect.
Yeah, completely. Yeah. And yet, you know what? A magical thing happens. If you don't immediately come right back and say, look, you're living in a crazy world, you're not reading the right newspapers and so on. If you don't come back, you just listen and you ask further, something magical happens. They say, oh, so you're not going to counter me. you're interested in what I think. And something happens. Something happens. It may happen in the first 5 minutes. It may happen in the first 10 minutes. It may take 3 days, but a person begins to say, it's not everything about Donald Trump I love. Where do I begin? He's a terrible person, but he's the only one we see that cares about the losers in this society, and we feel put down and we feel denigrated by those elites. He understands that, no one else does. But it takes a while for them to share their ambivalence, and you do it simply by listening. It's not hard to do. It doesn't change who you are.
Were you able to speak with all types of Trump supporters? After all, there's some that it seems as if it's impossible to talk to. So I can't imagine you talking to supporters of the Ku Klux Klan or the white supremacists. And yet you're a great proponent for dialogue with those that you don't agree with. I think I just read something that you wrote.
This book is not about a dialogue. It's about who they are and how they see the world, and what I came to call their deep story. I think under everybody's politics, there is an emotional deep story. And my job there was to simply understand what that deep story was, how it distorted the way they saw reality. And then what might be some ways to talk with them. But it's not really a dialogue. And you're right, I didn't talk to the Ku Klux Klan. I saw some survivalists, but no. So this is the mainstream right, not the violent right.
Yes, I do understand that. And you speak of the empathy wall. It's that wall that has to be crossed so that people can begin talking to each other. And yet, you cannot speak to everyone. So what's the limit? What's the unbridgeable gulf that you will not cross?
Yes. At the end of the paperback edition of my book, I propose 4 pillars of activism to fight fascism in our country, which I think there is some threat of. I'm optimistic that we can beat it back, but I think I'm calling for all people of goodwill to become activists. When I give talks around the country, this is something I say. But those 4 pillars go like this. The first pillar is simply to pay attention to every challenge to the pillars of democracy. Now, at the freedom of the press, for example, or the independence of the judiciary, basic pillars of democracy. So the first thing is just to sensitize yourself to that. The second thing is for the Democratic Party to completely revamp its platform so that it appeals to a majority of Americans, including the disaffected. The third pillar is to get out the vote. Now, in pillar 1, 2, and 3, you never have to talk to anybody you disagree with. You don't have to talk to the KKK. You don't have to talk to anyone who doesn't agree with you. But pillar 4 is to reach out across from one bubble to another in this divided country and to find common ground on particular issues, to learn to be a negotiator, to learn to be a bridge person on particular issues. There'll be an extreme that's not worth wasting your breath with. But I found a lot of potential issues on which one could make a common cause, including on the environment, including on the care of children, including getting money out of politics and integrity in politics, including the idea of having a responsive government. So even in this extreme, across these great extremes, there are potential crossover issues. So in the fourth pillar, which can strengthen the first three, I think alliances, we very much need to think in terms of coalition politics. And my fear is that the left will just talk to itself, right? That Black Lives Matters will just talk to Black Lives Matters, that feminists will just talk to feminists, and university students will just talk to university students. What we think we need to do, we all can empathize, we all can cross empathy walls, but what we need to do is get the skills of a mediator and use that empathy to get to contact our enemies, the other, on particular issues. And I think the great leaders from Nelson Mandela and on down have been able to do that. We need to look to those leaders.
In the forthcoming American elections, do you see a possible candidate from the left liberals who can implement the kind of agenda that you've set out? Do you see any individual there?
Yes, I think Beto O'Rourke of Texas is a brave, and he reminds me of Obama, and has a certain charisma, and I would look to him, but there are others as well. So yes, but what we need to do is more generally, not just look to one leader, but get coalitions going that have not been activated. With the decline of the labor union movement, I think we've lost a cross-national set of networks that we need new structures to build up.
Arlie, we're running out of time, so I'm just going to ask you one last question. You knew Iqbal Ahmed very well. It's now 20 years since we've lost him. How do you think he would be looking at the world today? And in particular, what would you think he would make of the outline of action that you've just proposed?
Oh, yes. Oh, gosh. I think he would agree. You know, Iqbal was a pragmatist. He was an idealist, but you could always find him at the side of a leader giving highly pragmatic advice. And so I think he would agree with this. I don't think he would be the purist in the ivory tower saying, no, I'll only talk to you if you totally agree with me. He was a man of many worlds, as you know, and in fact crossed almost seamlessly across these worlds, linguistic, cultural, political worlds. And he was very adept. He was a diplomat. He had those skills. And I think he would call for them now, without sacrificing his principles.
It was such a pleasure talking to you. Take care.
Yes, great to see you.